Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Shane and I'm delighted to be joined by Liam Cleary, MVP, Product Owner, Security and Development at Rencore, who will be talking to you today about the top 3 steps to securing Office 365. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC18. Don't forget to check out the Resource Center. This is packed with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit sharepointeurope.com/resource-center. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you have for Liam in the questions window. Some questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and will be added to the Resource Center, where you will be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to hand you over to our webinar presenter, Liam Cleary. Hello, Liam.
Hello. I'm excited to be here.
Great. Well, take it away, Liam.
Cool. Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody, or afternoon, or evening, or wherever you may be. The joys of time zones. I spend half my life battling with different time zones, being out in the US, even just here in stateside. So today, we're going to talk about the top 3 steps to securing your Office 365 environment. A little bit about me, if you don't know who I am. I'm Liam, Microsoft MVP, have been for 12 years now. I also own a little company called Shareclicity, and I'm also serving as product owner for security at Rencore. You can reach me on my common name, which is Hello, it's Liam, at all of those different places. And I do have some training courses that will kind of help in some of the things I'm going to talk about today over at Opsgility and Pluralsight. But that's not the most important thing, obviously. So a couple of facts about me. The first one is I'm from the UK. Was there for 30 odd years, hence the non-American accent, or maybe if you're from the UK, you'll think that I have an American accent, and I've lived here for 9 years. This one's always an interesting fact. I like to draw little people out on the page. And so a little unknown fact here is that I actually have 7 brothers and 5 sisters, and I enjoy running. I've run a few races. I like to run these races in the States called Ragnar races, where you run from first thing in the morning and basically run through the night until the next day. Obviously not just one person, but as a team. But that's me, a little few facts about me. So what are we going to talk about today? Talk about 4 specific things. We're going to talk about core security capabilities. We'll talk about Office 365 specific capabilities. Then we'll talk about Azure as well, because of course you should all know by now, or maybe you don't, that obviously some of the components that exist in Office 365 really come from the Azure services, and they're just wrapped as extra components inside Office 365. And then lastly, we'll talk about securing Office 365 as a whole. Okay, so let's talk about core security capabilities, because this is a topic that's really near and dear to me, and it has been for quite some time. Over the past few years, I spent most of my time speaking at conferences and traveling about with clients and really focusing on helping people understand why security is such an important thing. Because I think for years, people have kind of thought it was important, but not really. And it doesn't really become important until something happens. I mean, I use the example here in the States. So here in the US, when I moved here from the UK, it was very strange to actually go to a restaurant, and when they asked me to pay, you kind of give your credit card to the server, and the server disappears and walks off in the back somewhere with your credit card. You know, hopefully just charges you for the meal and not anything else, and doesn't clone the card. Whereas in the UK, for years, they brought the terminals to your desk, to your table. They didn't even touch the card. You just did it. So it's been interesting moving from there to here and seeing how security has kind of almost been a little bit lax across the world. But actually, one of the big things that changed here was when one of the companies, which is Target, had their point of sale hack. And at that point, it suddenly became a problem. And so now what we're seeing, which is great, is people are taking an interest in security more than they would before. So understanding what the services that you decide to use as an organization or as an individual has, as far as security goes, is now being questioned. So what we're seeing is advancements in this. So in the Office 365 Azure stack, I suppose the underlying core capabilities can be seen in these 4 blocks. The first one is identity and access management, mobile device and application management, information protection, and threat protection. So 4 specific areas that are covered really nicely within Office 365 and Azure. Now, obviously, identity and access management is about you as the user, your login process, your authentication request. Mobile device and app management is, you bring your own device to work. Maybe you don't get a company phone. Maybe you just want to get your work email on your iPhone. So the protections that we should put in place. Information protection is a big one. It's all about focusing on the content that you own, the data that you have, and making sure that you can control where that goes. Because in the past, it used to be very easy, where you could turn up into a corporate network, plug a machine into the network, plug a USB drive in and start copying data, and then walk out the building and nobody would know. But of course, people have got wise to that now. And then, of course, threat protection. And this is interesting to me as a topic, because threat protection is one that nobody really cared about unless you sat in the cybersecurity space. But what we now see is tools that are available that help you identify potential threats. Now, of course, remember, a threat isn't a threat until the threat does something. So it's a hypothetical situation that may happen. So you have an application, it has a vulnerability. It's only actually a threat if the vulnerability is then exploited. But it's a threat nonetheless. So let's talk about identity and access management. So first off, it's about discovering, restricting, and monitoring identities. So in Office 365 and under the guise of Azure, we can discover, restrict, and monitor identities. We can enforce on-demand or just-in-time administrative access, and we can also receive alerts, audit reports, and we can do access review. So you've got to think that process through. So if you're on a corporate network, not in the cloud, you go to lots of trouble to put Active Directory in, put policies in place, make you have password policies that are, change it every X days, include special characters, all that kind of fun stuff. We need to also utilize the same processes inside the cloud so that we are protecting our authentication piece. Then, of course, we have the idea of synchronized or cloud accounts. So a different approach. Obviously, taking your on-premises users, synchronizing them up to the cloud, and then allowing single sign-on to those applications that you wish to use that are protected via both. Now, of course, we can also do alerts and audit reports and access review for that too. Not only can we do that in the cloud, but we can also do that on premises. So using Azure AD Connect, we're able to connect the on-premises network into the cloud and get the best of both. Even if you're not going to utilize all of the cloud services, but you want to use, for example, OneDrive for Business in Office 365 and maybe email, it's perfect scenario to synchronize your identities to Azure Active Directory, really based on a simple thing that you're able to then push the on-premises kind of log information of who logged in and move that to the cloud to then utilize in some of the better tools that are available. And then, of course, the most important thing to remember is that you have a fully fledged Active Directory in the cloud. And if you only have Office 365, then obviously you may not know that. But when you go into the back of Office 365, there is a fully fledged Azure Active Directory. Now, the one that comes with it is free, so it has limited capabilities as far as some of the more secure features, but it exists behind there to manage users, apply policies, and things like that. So identity and access management is the building block number 1. The next one is mobile device and app management. Now, in here, the reason for this is so that we can do data control and separation. So the idea being that on a cell phone or a mobile device of some description, that you're going to have personal data and you're probably going to have corporate data. And so the idea being here is that you don't provide company devices anymore. Most people have a way newer and nicer phone than the ones that corporate companies can provide for them now. Just like most of the computers that people use at home tend to be more powerful and newer than the ones that they have at work. So mobile devices are the same. So bring your own device is now really important to most organizations. It reduces the cost, but security becomes a problem because you don't actually know what device they're bringing to the table. So mobile device management and app management is done in two scenarios, where we have what's called Office 365 MDM Lite, as I'm going to refer to it, which is an out-of-the-box capability to mobile device management, where you can create a simple profile that gets pushed down in a policy down to the devices that will, for example, make sure that as an organization, you're able to remove corporate data if you needed to. So if I was to leave your organization, you could simply press a button in the 365 tenant and say wipe corporate data, and any corporate data that was on the mobile device would be wiped out. Now that doesn't wipe the phone because we don't have that level of capability in the MDM Lite. What it does, it just sandboxes everything that's corporate data into a separate location. Now, of course, the next level above that is to go to something that's either a third party or go to Microsoft Intune, which is not an Office 365 capability, but more of an Azure component. But Microsoft Intune will give you everything you could ever imagine. So I'm going to roll out corporate devices. I'm going to enroll BYOD devices. I want to have the power by registering with Apple or Google or Microsoft to be able to really go down and lock the machines down. So the mobile device management and app management is a great one because this is another entry point into Office 365 and into your tenant. So it's data control and separation, it's data security configuration, and then restriction of apps and URLs, depending on how you want to do that. So for example, pushing out the secure managed browser to a device so that when they try to access websites, you have to use a secured browser to do that. So that's another bucket, mobile device and app management. The next one is information protection. And information protection is really around 4 pillars: detect, classify, protect, and monitor. The idea being here that I'm able to go through and scan and detect sensitive data based on a policy. So this is another area that we need to focus on, because if you think in the past, if we go through the news over the past few years, there have been USB sticks lost with confidential data on, or someone's just downloaded and emailed everything to their personal Gmail account or whatever else. Information protection lets you detect the content that has sensitive data. So for example, it could have PII data, it could have something else. We can then classify that automatically with the right licensing. We can come in and say, hey, whenever you see something that looks like a US social security number or a UK national insurance number or a bank account, then classify it as this, apply a sensitivity label, and then apply protections. For example, encrypting the content or restricting it from being copied and pasted in an email or leaving the organization. And then, of course, being notified automatically. And the great thing here is that this spans across mobile devices, in the cloud itself, and of course, using some of the tooling, this can be then working on premises into existing infrastructure. So for example, AIP, which will be one of the services, has a scanner that runs on premises that lets me crawl all of the content, for example, in a file share, to make sure that, if we find something that meets PII data, that we can automatically classify. So AIP is one of those features, along with rights management and a few other bits and pieces, but it lets you detect, classify, protect, and monitor. So you can see, so far we've talked about identity and access management. So that's one entry point into the data. Then mobile and device and app management, which is another entry point into the data. And now we're looking at the data itself. Once we're in there, what can we apply? So you can see we kind of build in this tower of protections. And then, of course, on the last bit of that is threat protection. And threat protection is where we get all of the great features. So you can see this covers 4 pillars: identity, which we've already talked about, apps and data, which we've kind of talked about, device management, which we have, and then infrastructure. So if you look on the left-hand side, when it comes to identity and apps and data, this is where the bulk of the protections exist. So if we start at the top on the left, we've got advanced threat analytics, we've got Azure Security Center, and Azure Active Directory. So those 3 go hand in hand. Azure Security Center is one that can be utilized inside the infrastructure as a service components. So if you're in the Azure portal and you spin up some VMs or you build a web application or something else, Azure Security Center is in charge of scanning your environment and looking for things that should be configured differently and will present you with that information. Azure Active Directory, as we talked about in the identity set, actually has some reporting capabilities as well. And then Advanced Threat Analytics is a service that kind of consumes all this information together and provides you information of potentially what's happening outside in the world also. Now, when we look at the apps and data, obviously we're going to start with Exchange, because obviously that's where we spend most of our life, is sending emails backwards and forwards. And so we have Exchange Online Protections. And these are wrapped into the Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection. So we have ATP components, for example, safe links, safe attachments. Safe links is in charge of making sure the links in the emails get rewritten so they're protected and validated against an approved list that Microsoft has and other vendors have, looking for malicious links. And then also attachments, so scanning the attachment, even going as far as ripping the attachment out, opening up in a virtualization environment automatically, scanning the contents against a whole series of rules, and then if it passes, attaching it back and sending it to you. So Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection is a great feature. Then you have Office 365 Threat Intelligence, which is another component that wraps all of those pieces together and gives you greater tools for threat analysis. And then right at the bottom of it, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is Microsoft Cloud App Security. And this is a core solution that runs and checks not just Office 365 and not just identity and apps and data, but will give you information that's really crucial into identifying a potential breach or security risk of some description. Now, if we flick to the right side here, you can see that we've got devices. And of course, right now it's Windows Defender, Advanced Threat Protection. Now you'll notice that the Advanced Threat Protection name shows up in multiple places. And so we have Office 365 version of that, and then Windows Defender version of that. So there's a little bit different in the way that those two work. And the Windows Defender piece is all about the Windows 10 devices down to it supports Windows 7.1 with Service Pack, Windows 7 Service Pack 1. And so you can apply policies and rules, and it can also use behavioral analysis at this point. So the idea being that you come to work in the morning, you turn your laptop on, you open your email, you send a few emails, you browse to OneDrive, you do a bunch of other stuff. The software itself automatically learns how you work. And so it builds a picture of you and says, well, hey, we know what Liam does. He does this every single day. Then all of a sudden you turn up at work one day and I decide that I'm going to be malicious and download 100,000 documents and steal them. The moment that you begin that process, the analysis suddenly picks up and says, whoa, hold on a minute, this isn't normal behavior. And then it starts to log and capture and notify at that point. So we have some great tooling available. And then, of course, we already talked about the infrastructure piece for Azure Security Service Center. So threat protection covers everything from start to finish. Now, of course, this is not just one switch that you can turn on. You can't suddenly come in and go, I want to enable threat protection, and everything just enables. It's small individual components, some of them separate license components that need to be enabled. And so that's an important thing I want to kind of get over to you, is that lots of these pieces require you to be licensed and that they need to be enabled in the places that you need to enable them. And I've worked with a few clients in the past where they've had data and security breaches in Office 365. Now, just to clarify, it's not like anybody hacked Office 365. They just performed some type of phishing attack or credential harvesting attack and were able to get the credentials and then log in as that user and do a bunch of stuff. But if they'd had some of these tools enabled, that process would have been stopped. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so what does Office 365 have as what I would class as core capabilities that we should look at? Well, really, this is the list. So in Office 365, it has core sharing controls. And so what I mean by that is it's the ability to control access to content inside the organization and external to the organization with different settings that can be managed by the administrator. So if the administrator doesn't want to allow external sharing, then that can be restricted, but the sharing controls can still work. So that's a top one for me, because the idea of SharePoint Online and OneDrive is collaboration. That's really the whole purpose of using it. So having sharing controls that can be something as simple as I share it with somebody else and I can time out the sharing, or I can do something else. That's important. The next one is cloud app security, and we will talk about this one a little bit later. But cloud app security does a little bit more than just what I would class as cloud app security. This is a security center that you should be looking at on a constant basis and tweaking and using, and we'll actually go through that shortly. Then we have what's called file recovery and protections. So there are new features available that allow you to recover files. For example, if you've got a Windows 10 machine using OneDrive, OneDrive now has the capability of protecting from malware. So it keeps moaning and nagging at you on Windows 10 to say, hey, you want to put your files in OneDrive because we can restore them back for you in the event of an issue. So there are file recovery and protection capabilities available. Then, of course, if you have the right license, we have attack simulation, which is something I've talked about a few times. Attack simulation is the ability for you to attack your individual users. 3 different types that are available. And it's all about testing your end user to make sure they understand that they shouldn't be doing this, or their password should not be like that, etc. Data loss prevention, which we'll talk about again shortly, all about looking for data that contains sensitive information and then applying policies and controls. Message tracing was something that was added recently over the past few months to Office 365, where now that applies in the Security and Compliance Center, where I can now track messages and actually view header information of the emails and things like that. Then we have unified auditing and logging. And this, you may not think this is a security capability, but a big part of security capabilities is the ability to audit and to log and report. And so there's great tooling now available for unified auditing and logging, for the ability for you to see not just user activities, but also admin activities, as well as see that information in multiple locations. So if we're talking about auditing and logging and looking at the logging side, it can start all the way back in the Azure Active Directory, all the way through to the the Security and Compliance Center, into various locations there, all the way to each individual service has some capabilities of logging and seeing information. And then you can skip all the way ahead to the service endpoints that are available. You can utilize PowerShell to retrieve those. There's a whole host of different ways. So security capabilities require a level of auditing and logging. Then, of course, we talked about mobile device management, whether you go with mobile device management Lite, or whether we go with Microsoft Intune and go the full thing, where you're doing everything from mobile phone, cell phone devices, to tablets, even down to Windows 10 devices or laptops that are connecting to the network, but a full mobile device management solution. Excuse me. And then finally, core permissions. Now, you may not think that just the ability to assign permissions is a core security capability, but it really is. Now, these don't always get done correctly. Over the years, since working with SharePoint way back before 2001, people always get the permissions wrong at some point. The same thing as they used to in file shares. They would create a file system, they would put NTFS permissions in there, they would then do file share permissions, the permissions would then compete with each other, or you wouldn't clean them up afterwards, and you would end up with people that had left the organization that actually had accounts that still existed, that weren't disabled, and still had access to a whole bunch of content. Or they would move departments and they would still gain access to other locations because they would never be updated. SharePoint often becomes that place. Same as Exchange, same as OneDrive, same as other locations. It can end up with permissions being set incorrectly and not being able to work. So what does Azure add to the table? So Azure adds what I would class as 6 fundamental building blocks on top of Office 365. The first one is multi-factor authentication. Fundamentally, multi-factor authentication is something that needs to be enabled, and we'll talk about that in a second, but it's a core building block. And that came in, it used to be on-premises solution you could utilize as well, but there's multi-factor in the cloud, and this should be a core capability that we utilize. Second capability that's been around for a little bit now is conditional access. the idea of you interrogating the user coming in or the device coming in, if you're creating mobile device policies, and locking people out or allowing them in by conditional access policies. For example, creating a geolocated policy that would say, hey, you're trying to come in from, Japan or whatever else, and for whatever reason, Japan is an area where you're not allowed to connect, then you can restrict and control that access. Then we have what's called privileged identity management, so PIM for short. This is one where we have the ability to control access to administrative accounts, even down to the point where we can workflow that process. So you want to grant me, for example, administrator access, and we have the ability to control that. So we have privileged identity management, and then we also have privileged access management that go hand in hand. Identity protection, so extra policies and controls that you can put in place onto the account. So you have to remember, when I add an account to Office 365, it appears in Azure Active Directory. So having a feature in Azure Active Directory for identity protection just enhances the Office 365 capabilities. Then, of course, we have information rights management, which has been around for a while, but it's kind of been elevated to a different level now. Information rights management is all about creating the policies that would go on the content. So encryption, for example, making sure that you can't forward an email or print or copy and paste content out of it, etc. And then, of course, we talked about information protection, and I mentioned AIP. AIP and IRM, those two go hand in hand to give you the Azure security capabilities that you're looking for. So these are 6 building blocks that you should be looking at as part of your Office 365 security. Okay, so the reason why we're actually going to talk about this now is about securing Office 365. So really, it comes down to a couple of things. The first one is it comes down to licensing. It really does. If you start with an E1 license, don't expect half of those features to be available to you. If you have an E3 license, you'll get more. If you have an E5 license, you'll have more. If you have an E3 plus EMS, so security license, then you'll have even more. If you don't have Azure P1s or P2s, some of those features won't work either. So it comes down to the licensing that you purchase. And too often, I've seen too many companies that won't pay to have the extra licensing for the protection because they don't want to pay the extra money. The problem is, and I'm going to be the first to tell you, is that once you move to the cloud, you move a level of ownership away from you and a level of control away from you that you can't do anything about. So there's this great diagram that Microsoft have where it's like, SaaS, PaaS, IaaS, on-prem, whatever. And the more you move to the cloud software as a service, which is what we're really talking about, the less functionality and controls that you have in some areas. It's a good thing because it means that some of the other pieces are available. But what Microsoft does really well is they provide all the services, but what they don't often do is enable all of those to begin with. So my second thing is to use common time-tested options. And what I mean by that is things that you've been doing from day one, like, yes, use password policies. Yes, use encryption. Yes, assign permissions. Use the same things. Things haven't changed. Just because you move to the cloud doesn't mean you no longer assign permissions. You still need to do that. Just because you move to the cloud doesn't mean you can allow people to use password 1 or password 1234 as a password. In fact, it should be even tighter and restrictor in the cloud because it means anybody can try to log in. Because really, think about it. If I want to break into an Office 365 tenant, all I have to do is come up with the name of the tenant that matches an organization. And actually, you can do some very crafted Google searches and you will find the names of the tenants for organizations. Then I just have to figure out names. Did you create the name as first name dot last name, or was it first name last letter, or first letter and last name? And then I've got the username because the username for 365 is a UPN/email address format. Now I have to figure out passwords, but now I have an email. So now I could do a phishing attack and send you something that may work. So for example, in a webinar I gave recently for a security company, we actually talked about that and created a cloned version of the Office 365 login page. I did it on a Linux machine. I basically cloned the login page and then put that in an email in a crafted way. So when the end user hit the link, it went to this non-Microsoft Office 365 login page, and then they just typed in their credentials. And unless they were a pretty savvy person, you would not have known that it wasn't the Office 365 page. Now, there were some telltale signs. If you were looking at, for example, it wasn't the URL, wasn't Microsoft.com, it was something else, and the SSL certificate was different. But if it all matches, 90% of the time, people don't actually check whatsoever. So use the things that you've been using now, but just apply them into the cloud. Okay, so let's talk about the three things, top 3 steps of things that you need to include. Now, obviously, all the rest is just as important, but there are 3 for me that are probably the most important right now. And that's purely based on just out-of-the-box features that are there, and the Cloud App Security one is one that you'll probably have to pay extra for. But multi-factor authentication, I cannot say this one enough. Multi-factor, 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 multi-factor. In 2 instances of security breaches, if multi-factor authentication had been enabled on the accounts, the breach would never have happened. Then we have data loss prevention. Data loss prevention goes a long way in controlling the flow of data. And then Cloud App Security is all about permissions and login and security. So we're going to look at these. I'm going to come out of my presentation, just minimize this, and then I'm going to go make my Firefox a bit louder. Now, if you're not using Firefox, I encourage you to, purely based on these containers that we can create, which are fantastic. Okay, so I'm in my Office 365 admin site. The first thing that needs to happen, if you've never done this, is I'm going to go to my users. I'm just going to type my user account. I'm going to search for the user. And if we scroll to the bottom, we get Manage Multi-Factor Authentication. So I'm going to click Manage Multi-Factor Authentication. It'll take me to the logon. And then what I end up with is I'm at the multi-factor page. And from here, I can go through and then select the individual users, for example. So I'm going to say my user account, select it, and you'll see that mine's been enabled. I've enforced my multi-factor. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means a whole bunch of different things. Multi-factor is not an easy decision of whether to enable it or not. And that's purely based on that enabling multi-factor requires you, and maybe you're the tech-savvy person, but it requires the end individual user to actually do something else when they come to the login screen. And that's a problem, especially when you live in the world of BYOD, because most people don't necessarily want to have to get a text message on their personal phone and type that information in or whatever else. But what it means is that I'm able to, at the point of login, stop the login process to verify that that user is the person that they say they would be, because it's that second factor. It's something that you have. And so historically, it was always about using text messages, and that was the great way of doing it. So let me just actually get rid of the users here, and I'm going to choose a different user. I'm going to choose Megan. Now, she's not enabled for it, and so I'm going to click Manage User Settings, and what we can see here is that I can force the end user to provide contact methods every single time, and I can delete any app passwords that were generated, and I can restore multi-factor if I needed to. But what I can do is simply click Enable, and when I click Enable, it just says wait, and it's done, and that's it. And honestly, that was as simple as it was. Now, what does that mean for the end user? Well, that means the end user has to then enroll. So the next time that end user signs out and signs in, they'll be stopped at the authentication mechanism and then asked to go through the process. Now, for me, I like to use the app. So the Microsoft Authenticator app, or you can use any other. I actually use Authy, and I use LastPass Authenticator and a bunch of others too. So what this means is, I'm actually just going to disable that because it doesn't help me when I try to log in as a test later. But what it means is that I scan the little code, and then it notifies me on the phone. So what I do is I use the app, because instead of it sending me a text message, it sends me a little notification that just says, do you want to approve it? And yes, I do. Now that's great, because it means I have a second factor and I have protection. Now, what's great here is the multi-factor components can also be bolted into a conditional access policy. Now, the conditional access policies, I'm actually just going to scroll down to my admin centers, expand them all down, and I'm going to say Azure Active Directory. And when I get to Azure Active Directory, which is one way that you can access it if you've never done it in a tenant, I can click Azure Active Directory right here. And this will give me the list of users in there. And if I scroll down, you can see I have a conditional access option that's available. Now, you'll need to have the right licensing enabled, but I can say new policy on conditional access. I can pick the use. I can say these are the conditions. So device platforms, device state, sign-in risk. If I click here, it's going to say configure, select the risk I want to assign. So for example, whenever anything meets this level, it's going to be that one. And then maybe it's going to be locations that I wish to use. So I'm going to say, yes, I want to select locations and say, these are my list of locations that I've defined. So you can apply a conditional access policy, and then as part of that process, let me just close that out here. I can go through and grant access controls, and then as part of this, I can say I want to grant it, and I want to say require multi-factor authentication. So as somebody comes in, I can force that multi-factor. So this is normally common when you're connecting with a mobile device and you need to go through an enrollment, that you'll then say, well, whenever someone comes in with an iPhone, I want to, when they come in and try to do OneDrive for Business, I'm going to require multi-factor authentication at that point. So you get the combination of both. You can say multi-factor on the account level, and you can also force that on a conditional access policy. So that's the first step. First step, if you haven't done it, go back, create a multi-factor enablement on all of the accounts, or at least do it on some of the accounts to start with, like start with the admin accounts. Admin accounts should have multi-factor. Historically, there was an argument we used to have around you couldn't use PowerShell properly because of multi-factor. That's gone away. No excuses anymore. Multi-factor enable on the accounts. That's step number one. So once you have that, second step is data loss prevention. Data loss prevention for me is fantastic. It's a very powerful tool. It means that I can go in and create a policy which uses existing templates that are defined. So you can see Microsoft have created these. You'll see we can select the country that we wish to be from. So I'm in the US. So this gives me my list of US ones that are available. If I click privacy, you can see I have them here. So I'm going to say PII data. And in the US side, that would be tax numbers, social security, and UK and US passport numbers. So that means I'm going to search for that in my content. So I'm going to click next. It's going to give me a name. I'm going to click next. And then I can choose the locations that I wish to utilize. So Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, I can exclude or include as needed. I can turn them off if needed. Maybe I don't want to apply it to OneDrive because we're not using it yet, or maybe I don't want to put it into Exchange yet. But my advice would be, if you're using any of these, you apply that policy. I'm going to click next. See, then we get the ability to customize, and this is where the power comes in, because too often I see people just go through and click, 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 and just do the standard ones, where actually it's more powerful if we use the advanced settings. So first off, we can detect when this content is shared. So if it's going externally or inside. So this is where you'll probably have different rules that will determine and work based on which direction it's being shared. But I always like to use advanced settings, click next, and then what we get is this ability to kind of change the volume levels. So you can see, for example, we have detect when it goes outside. This is the information types, and this is that. And you can see that this is the low level one, and then we have a high level one. And what that means is, that means that if there's a low level amount of information, it's going to execute this rule, and if it's high, it does this. But if we click edit rule, now we get to where we can really go to town and kind of change how things work. So for example, we've got the name, we have the conditions, we have exceptions, actions, etc. So if I go to conditions, you can see that we've got those 3 items that were in that policy. I can come in and say, I want to add another sensitive information type. Now notice what that does. It's not having me pick the category. I can pick the individual. So if I want to add a bank routing number to that one, then I can add that. So now it no longer becomes the out-of-the-box PII. It becomes the one that I tell it to. You can then customize the instance count and the match accuracy. So I can say, oh, okay, I don't want to look for 1 because 1, we're going to take the risk. maybe I want to change that and say I'm only looking every time there's 2 instances or more, then that's what I want to do. And I want to make sure that my accuracy is 90% accurate before I flag anything. Now, I wouldn't advise that. 75 is what's set as normal, but you could change it if you needed to. Then we have the ability to say all of these or any of these. Now, of course, all of these will severely limit what you can get, but any of these will let you do others. Now, if I do add group, you can see that I can then go and do an add or an or, and then I can start adding. You'll notice labels shows up. And labels is the ability for you to pick labels that have been defined in the system. So, for example, if I do PII retention, so now what's going to happen is, I'm just going to say that. What it's going to do, it's now going to look for anything that matches this, as well as anything that has the label of PII retention policy. Now, I couldn't do that in the standard policy. So we keep going down. I can say with people outside the organization, I can then add conditions and go through and say, I'm looking for this IP address, I'm looking for a recipient domain or a specific document property, and I can add those values in and type them in there if needed. I can then do exceptions and add those in to say, except, if it's Liam, don't send, don't have it, don't pick it up. I can then do actions and definitely restrict and encrypt the content. And now we get the ability to say, well, actually, I would like to block people from sharing the content completely if it matches this rule. And I want to apply this to everyone or only the people, and you get to apply that. And if it's mail, this is where you'll see that you'll have to have separate policies. I can say encrypt email messages, applies to that. And then, of course, we get the notification section and policy tips that come up for the end user. So notify these people. I can customize the message and say, hey, you did something silly. Don't do that again. I can override it and let people say, actually, if I do let people override, I can say require a business justification to override it. So that means an end user gets flagged and they can say, no, actually, that's okay to send. I would use that one sparingly. And then the incident reports that come out. Excuse me. So you can see that we have some great power in what can be done as far as condition access. So I'm going to get rid of that one because I don't need it. So if I go down and say save, it's going to come back and say, oh, wait there, you need to fix the errors because not everything matches the way that it should do. So you can go through and tweak all of the settings. I'm just going to cancel that, click yes. So that gives me my rule. I can click next. Then, of course, the first thing you should do is like to test it out first. Number one, don't just create it and then turn it on. Test it first, let it see what it brings up, because if I just cancel this and go back to here, you'll see the reporting lists out policy matches and false positives. And so you want to use that to tweak what's going on with the content. Okay, so that's DLP, straightforward. So we have multi-factor on the accounts to protect from access coming in. Then we have DLP for content going out. And then lastly, we have Cloud App Security for content and things that are connecting backwards and forwards outside. So I'm just going to go to alerts in Cloud App Security. Cloud App Security gives me a full breakdown of what's going on. You can see, for example, infrequent country logins, discovered app security breach, suspicious activity, log on from risky IP addresses. So if I do discovered app security breach, it says, according to public information, Facebook was breached on this specific point, and it notifies me and says, hey, looks like you're using Facebook. Did you know that there was a breach? Now, what's great is you can look at the score for an app that you may be connecting in, and then you can break down and see the kind of permissions and levels of access that are defined. So you can say from a security perspective, it gets 9 because the only thing it doesn't do is admin audit and IP address restriction. From a compliance perspective, it doesn't meet any of those. And from a legal perspective, there's a whole bunch of stuff that it doesn't do. So the average score comes out to 7. Now, if we go back to alerts, it also means that I can look for things like suspicious activity or mass downloads. So remember we talked earlier, I come into work one day and I decide to start mass downloading things. So you can see it says the user Johanna has downloaded 25 unique objects in a single session. Now we can look at this and go, okay, hold on. Okay, so that's OneDrive for Business. So that means OneDrive for Business is potentially synchronizing content, and that's why 25 or more items have come down. But it means that you got notified I can come in and say mark as read, read resolve, or I can adjust the policy that notifies you and say unusual file download. You can go down to here and you can see the settings that are available. So you can say for all the users, or I can change the configuration here. But what I also have is, you'll notice I have some governance controls too. So this is where the power comes in. So think of what I talked about. A client has a security breach. The Office 365 account is compromised. No multi-factor authentication, so it didn't get stopped, and it didn't get picked up because there was no login, and it didn't get blocked because there was no cloud app security policies that wouldn't understand that something was taking place and didn't suspend the user account or notify, etc. So when you put those three things together, multi-factor authentication to protect the entry point of the account coming in, data loss prevention to control the data as it leaves the organization, because when the accounts were logged in, they were trying to steal data. But if you'd applied an AIP policy, for example, data loss prevention and IRM policies, the content couldn't have been opened in the first place. And actually, we could have stopped all of that by using cloud app security and restricting access to that. So let's go back to my list of options that are here. You can see we have risky IP addresses. You can see someone's logging in with Tor, so going over the Tor network, and so that's an easy one. And at any point when we get the notification that comes in, you can see right here, I can see the list, and this is an IP address that's classed as a risky IP. You can see my Enrico is logging in from Sweden on a risky IP address. I can scroll down and see more information about the user. Excuse me. I can click on any one of these items, and what it will do is give us more information and come back and say, actually, this person has 4 other open alerts. Now, if we change to IP address view, you can see that actually there are 7 alerts that relate to that specific IP address. So if I click that, it'll take me to a new page, and what should load is the activities that relate to that IP address also. So you can see there's a couple of other people that have been logging in with that risky IP address too. So Alan's been using that one too. So it gives you a picture of what's been going on. Now, if I go back to my alerts and scroll down a bit further, you can see publicly shared confidential files. This is where you get the benefit of tying everything together. So from a data loss prevention policy to advanced information protection to a rights management policy, everything gets tied. So as content is shared that shouldn't be shared, if it's labeled and flagged, then it can be brought up. So you can see here, it says the file policy, publicly shared confidential file, was matched and this document was shared. So what we can see is that this was the file, it was Megan, she shared the file, it matched that policy. We can then go through and see the history of what took place. So you can see this one was matched, she downloaded, she broke sharing inheritance, she created an anonymous link to the file. So we get this full picture of what's going on. Now go back to my story. The client gets breached, there's no multi-factor, they're not able to block from that one. Then they come into cloud app security, which isn't enabled because they haven't enabled everything that's needed. And so there's none of this information. Now imagine how powerful this information would be if they could instantly have gone into cloud app security and gone, okay, hold on, that's where they logged in. This was where they logged in from. They went through and did this, and build a picture. Now, luckily, lots of audit and login information is still available. So you're able to get to some of that. Now, just before we go back to the slides, I wanted to add an extra layer in. And this is where we talk about an Azure Advanced Threat Protection, which is really focused on the desktops itself. So think about that. We have cloud app security that covers everything connecting in and also can consume on-premises data by uploading log files. But then we go to an Azure Advanced Threat Protection and we're talking about the machines themselves. So you can see that I have a Windows 10 machine, for example, and I'm going to say Honey token activity. You can see that Linda, she's a software engineer. She's on this machine, which we refer to as the victim PC. And then, of course, we have the domain. And you can see what happened. There was a weird type of connection that was made from that machine to there. So you can see here, it was Kerberos, there was a weird login, there was a failure. If I go into the victim PC and click on here, what this does, this will load me the list of things that took place. So you can see that it was connected to the ATP components, and once it had been connected, this person logged in, then did that. The account password was changed, so you could move things around. You could see that the help desk connected, the operating system was updated to a new version, and we can keep going. Then all of a sudden, we can see that somebody started messing around with the machine. So you've got to think of the whole story here, that when it comes to securing Office 365, even though those top three things are multi-factor, data loss prevention, and then cloud app security, when you start to look at the services that are enabled, they all join together collaboratively and protect everything across the board. So let me just come out of my browser here, and I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. Okay, so what are the recommendations that you get from me then? Well, first off, utilize out-of-the-box security controls. That's the first thing. If they're there, turn them on, switch them on, enable them. It doesn't really matter what they are, because if you don't have them, you'll regret it in the event of an issue. Don't forget what Azure Active Directory can do also. Enable the following: multi-factor for all accounts. Now, obviously, you guys need to manage that expectation with your end users. Enable data loss prevention rules, and that should be done by default, including mail flow rules as part of that data loss prevention. And then enable cloud app security. And my big thing right here, pay the extra for the licenses. It may be a couple of extra dollars, a couple of extra pounds, whatever it might be, but pay the extra for the licenses to give you the security that you need. Because when we move to the cloud, we make an investment long term, and we lose that level of ownership of doing something that we did before on premises. So just pay the extra. It's not that much more expensive in the grand scheme of what would it cost if there was a security breach. Okay, so on here I have a few resources that might be useful. I've put the links to the Pluralsight courses that I kind of done, which might be help. There's a few blog posts that can kind of help you too. And then at the bottom, I've put the link to the Microsoft demos by scenario. If you haven't used the demos, then go to demos.microsoft.com. You can register with an account, a live ID, or an organization ID, and then you can spin up by scenario a full tenant. It takes about 10 minutes to spin up, and then you get a 90-day tenant to be able to play with. Okay, and here's my contact details if you need me. But let's have a look at some questions then, Shane.
Thanks for a great presentation, Liam. Yes, we will now start with some questions, and should you wish to ask Liam a question, type it into the questions window. Okay, first question, Liam. To use cloud app security, should every user in the organization be licensed?
Yes, so it's an interesting one, that one, and I've had lots of conversations with Microsoft about this. So cloud app security actually just works. So in every tenant, you'll go in, and when you click managed advanced alerts in security and compliance, there'll be an option that will say switch on cloud app security. You'll say yes, and then mysteriously it just works, and everything gets captured, but you are not licensed to actually do that. So you don't need to buy E5 licenses for everybody, which includes it. You can have the license that you have, and then you buy the cloud app security license. Or if you've already got the EMS security licenses, you can do that. But you are legitimately supposed to buy the license for every single user so that you can use that, which is a bit of a strange idea, just because the end user doesn't get any benefit. They don't actually see anything from cloud app security. It's normally IT and security. But yes, everybody needs to be licensed for that.
Okay. What is the difference between Advanced Threat Protection and Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection?
Perfect. Yeah, so I highlighted those in the slide. So Advanced Threat Protection is the components that are built directly into the Office 365 stack and purely focus on the services in Office 365 only. Like, those PCs don't protect your Windows 10 machine. They are literally just for services. Whereas Windows Defender ATP is the component that was baked into the Windows Defender app that sits on Windows now, which is the old firewall that used to be there. And that's a cloud connector that now lets you take, so when I showed you in that last one, the Azure ATP components where it can monitor the devices, that's what that component is. So different license as well. And actually what's interesting is Microsoft now have a secure score for the Windows Defender also, which it only had for Office 365, but they now have one for that too. So one's for the devices, the Windows devices connecting, one is for the services in 365.
Okay. Liam, when can we expect your new Security of SharePoint online course on Pluralsight?
So I need to do an update, do I? I'm actually working on the one I'm working on right now is, believe it or not, backup and recovery right now is the one I'm working on, and so I'm looking at doing another one going forward. So we'll see. I can't promise anything how soon that will be, but definitely on the table of things to do.
Okay. Can you give a brief demo on creating labels?
So labels, there's 50 million different ways of creating labels. So it depends where you want to create the labels themselves. So if you're in Office 365, let me go back to my Security and Compliance Center. In the Security and Compliance Center, underneath classification, we have labels and label policies. So this is what's referred to as the Office 365, supposed to be what's going to be the unified labeling process. So we have sensitivity labels, and then we have published labels that can be applied to retention. So this is one location where you would create a label. I'm just going to type some random text, nothing special. I can choose encryption for the label at this point. So I can say choose the options that would apply, etc. I'm just going to click net. Oh, I should have actually assigned permissions here. Let me just do all tenant members. That'll do. I can do content marking at this point. I can add a watermark, a header, and a footer to the content also. So let's say I want to add a watermark, and I'm just going to call it draft, let's say. Click next. Data loss prevention. So then what I'm actually doing is enabling data loss prevention labels. So it means that I can apply those. Now DLP settings and stuff it's not completely all enabled, but this will be for the Windows devices, especially for Microsoft Intune. Now I have my label, I can click create and off it goes. I'm not going to click create because it'll create it and then it can take about a day for a label to actually go across and do it. Now, if you want to auto classify the content with the label, you do need to have a different license for that. So that's one type of label. The other type of label is if I go down to my admin one and I'm going to go to the Azure portal. I'm just going to go to the Azure AD one. I'm actually just going to, I'll tell you what, I can just type the URL here, portal.azure.com. So I'm actually going to go into the main Azure portal versus the Azure AD one. And then from here, I'm going to type information and it should come up and you can see AIP. And then what AIP does, AIP lets me also create labels at this point too. So you can see labels, these will load. These are my label ones that I've got for AIP. So, and there's also a third place that you can create labels. So the third one is directly inside a library in the list. You can go in and say create a label inside SharePoint. So there's three different options. The unified one is this one, which is supposed to be going unified across everything, but it's not quite there yet. But this is the AIP labeling. So hopefully that kind of gave you a quick 30 seconds of how to do that.
Super. Would you recommend activating MFA only for the access to Office 365 from outside the company network or also from inside?
So that's the interesting conversation. So inside the network, normally it's protected, and so you probably wouldn't. So if you enable multi-factor on an account perspective, then no matter where you log in from, it'll force you to do multi-factor. So so like I did earlier when I went into the account and said, hey, enable multi-factor, if I logged in from my network machine versus my Mac machine at home, it would still prompt me for MFA. If we're using multi-factor with conditional access, then 90% of the organizations I've worked with recently, they only want that to be forced outside the network. And so I'm okay either way. Like I like the extra protection either way. And actually, because I'm an IT person, having my phone pop up with a notification that says, do you wish to approve the access, whether it's inside or out, really makes no difference to me. I actually quite like that level of protection. But for an organization, where you've got a whole range of ages of people and technical ability and everything else, I would say stick with external. So if you come in from outside, definitely multi-factor. Because in that scenario, in the organization that's close to me that had the breach, they were logging in from Nigeria. So the hacker group was in Nigeria and they were logging in there. I mean, why they allowed that, I have no idea. But that's because there was no conditional access policies, there was no multi-factor and things like that too. So that would have been stopped if they'd had a policy for external logging in.
Okay. Quick bit of feedback here. Hi Liam, thanks for the superb webinar today. I've attended another one an hour before yours, and I have to say that your webinar is galaxies ahead of the other, which was a similar topic. So there you go.
Oh, thank you, thank you. I aim to please.
I'll just get some halo effect there as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
What is the roadmap for each service? Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, do you know?
Oh, that's a big question. What's the roadmap for them?
I think that's something that nearly have to attend the European SharePoint conference.
Yes, yeah. I was going to say
Jeff Teeper talk about it.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I don't think I'm the person to answer that one. I mean, obviously, as a Microsoft MVP, we kind of have insight into what's coming, but in all fairness, we don't have insight to everything. But like you said, I mean, Jeff Teeper and the Microsoft team, Dan Home, and all that kind of stuff at the conference, they will outlay the roadmap of what to expect. Now, Ignite did publish some information, but just remember how Microsoft are. They are constantly turning around changes again and again and again and again and again. So by the time they announce Microsoft Ignite stuff and say it's coming, by the time you get to the European conference, they'll probably have more to come out, which we don't even know about yet. So definitely attend the conference.
Just to add to that, the European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure conference is in Copenhagen in Denmark from November 26th to 29th. So see SharePointEurope.com for full details.
Perfect.
Liam, we're pretty much out of time. Thank you so much for your webinar today. Really appreciate you taking the time out to help us.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you for having me again. Always fun every time.
Brilliant, Liam. Thank you once again, Liam, and have a great day.
And you too. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, so thank you to Liam. That is all for today. Just bear with me here for one moment. I'll get our screen back. Yeah, so see SharePointEurope.com for full details of the conference coming up if you do want to know the roadmap, and /register- for webinars for further details on all upcoming webinars, or visit our resource center for all previous webinars, ebooks, etc. That is all for today. Thank you for joining us. Take care and goodbye.